There is an interesting tale to tell about why we came to Australia. I would imagine for most families, there was a dream of a better life, more opportunities to buy a home, earn lots of money, and provide more opportunities for your children. When I asked my mother about our reasons for moving out here, she said she had seen an advert in the paper in England and thought it sounded like a good idea. My mother had dreamed of moving to Canada, but it cost £200, and the chance of saving that amount was slim, with 4 children to raise. So the advertisement, perhaps, was another way to live her dream without saving lots of money. On a whim, and with very few possessions, we left Southampton on the Fair Star and arrived in Adelaide on the 14th of October, 1965. Abby English.
Between 1945 and 1970, Australia's post-World War II population exploded. Thanks to the Assisted Passage Scheme, programs such as the Populate or Perish mandate and Bring Out of Britain, Australia began to grow rapidly in both population and industry, just as the Chifley government had envisioned. In South Australia, the Playfer government and the South Australian Housing Trust shared that vision, creating in 1955 what by the 1960s was being hailed as the city of tomorrow, Elizabeth. The post-war Australia-wide expansion of industry called for more workers, and the population increased rapidly through migration schemes which offered free or assisted passages. In South Australia, the population increased by approximately 150,000 between 1947 and 1954, and much of this was due to the influx of migrants, mainly from the British Isles. With construction on Elizabeth commencing in 1954, she was uniquely positioned to take advantage of this influx, and Thomas Playford ensured that the Housing Trust worked hard from their offices in Australia House in London to sell British migrants on the idea of settling in the new city of tomorrow, named especially after their Queen, with lots of streets and parks with royal names such as Windsor Green, Phillip Highway, and Prince Charles Walk. Armed with pamphlets and promotional films such as 1961's A Place to Grow, potential newcomers were told of a place with affordable, modern housing, modern shops, schools, and plenty of employment, especially for men. Upon arrival, however, many found that work could not initially be found unless they were willing to travel closer to North Adelaide, and the housing that was waiting was, well, in many cases, waiting indeed, waiting to be built. So for many, life in South Australia began with unemployment and accommodation in one of South Australia's many migrant hostels.
Well, we came over by air in 1965. It cost us £10 each. Children were free. Most of the information we received was very misleading. My husband and brother-in-law had the idea that they would be able to build houses of wood, which would be laying around. We expected to see wild animals running around. All we saw were fields full of thistles. We came over to Adelaide from Melbourne in a tiny old plane and were so disappointed to see tin roofs. It was stinking hot. The Good Neighbour people met us at Adelaide and welcomed us. And there we were, put on a bus bound for Elizabeth. Halfway here it broke down, so we had to take all the cases off and wait for a relief bus to be sent. More fields full of thistles. Ooh, also some dirty brown sheep. English sheep are white. We looked everywhere for a tap to get a drink of water. It was 108 degrees in the shade. My husband wanted to go home. He didn't like the thistles. We were all wearing our winter woolies. I didn't think I'd be able to breathe. When we reached the Smithfield hostel, it was evening, but straight away we found a meal. Mrs. D. Scales of Elizabeth West.
The Smithfield Migrant Hostel was one of several hostels around Adelaide that was set up to accommodate the new arrivals on a temporary basis. Situated in a former army camp adjacent to the railway yards at Smithfield. The camp had been set up as a military supply depot for country areas north of Smithfield in early 1941. Several large stores constructed of wood and iron, together with the administration and other buildings, were in use until the camp was closed after the war. At Smithfield, plans were made to convert the former army storage buildings into living quarters for 100 people by the end of January 1949. The long-term aim was to provide accommodation for 800 people, but between 250 and 300 was the maximum realised at any one time over the next 20 years. Two of the large buildings offered dormitory accommodation for single people, while families were allocated a section in the main building, usually consisting of a sitting room and 2 or 3 bedrooms.
We were originally placed in Pennington with all the other English families. Mother didn't like it much, too impersonal. Thankfully, after a month, they decided to move the families who were attached to the RAAF base in Edinburgh to Smithfield. Mother was much happier there and felt more part of a community.
No cooking was allowed in the living quarters, and all meals were served in a communal dining hall. Shared bathing and toilet facilities were provided in an ablution block attached to each building. Most families who were unaccustomed to this partly institutionalised lifestyle made the best of the situation, although night shift workers found it difficult to sleep during the day, with noisy children at play nearby. Some former migrants have described how they turned up the noise level on the wireless so they could hold a private conversation, as the walls between the rooms were so thin. If several people did this at the same time, the noise in the building was deafening.
We were taken by bus on what seemed a journey to nowhere, for after we passed Japes Cross, it was nothing but paddocks until we reached the hostel at Smithfield. Our first impressions of Smithfield Hostel was that of a displaced persons camp. Rows of Nissen huts set in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a wire fence. It even had gates at the front entrance. Our first thoughts were, what have we come to? Mr. H. Wright.
Mother remembers the canteen where you could have an account and pay for your goods on payday. She once sent my older sister Helen to the canteen to get some digestive biscuits. Helen was only 7 and asked for some suggestive biscuits. We still laugh about that.
Accommodation was not charged for until the family's breadwinner found a job and started work. The tariff was based on the number of people in the family and the wages earned. The length of stay in the hostel varied between 3 and 12 months, while people looked for more permanent housing. Residents were not encouraged to stay longer than 12 months, and few wanted to do so. But people who could not find work or housing easily could apply for an extended period. The need for hostel accommodation passed its peak by 1971, as immigration numbers lessened, and by August of that year, only 5 families were still in residence when the hostel closed.
One of Mother's most enduring memories is sitting on the steps outside our dormitory with a cup of tea in summer, looking east towards the hills and watching the full moon rise, big, round and yellow, swallowing up the sky as it climbed high against the deepening blue heavens. There was nothing to obscure the view. From her front step to the horizon was vacant land of gravel roads or straw-coloured stubble, clouds of dust rising from the as-yet unsealed main North Road, and a few gum trees breaking up the landscape. Mother had never seen a moon like it in the UK. The full moon still rises over those hills and can still catch the eye with its striking colour and enormity, But suburbia now covers those undulating hills. The empty wheat fields are gone, and the peace and quiet of those bygone days live only in the memories of those who lived them.
It is only about 5 years since, with the permission of Her Majesty the Queen, I was able to name our new town Elizabeth. Since that time, large factories have been established, a very large city indeed has grown up, population of some 25,000 people, a very pleasant place to live in has been established. I believe that the people of Elizabeth are very happy people indeed.
By 1960, the South Australian Housing Trust was the most powerful housing authority in Australia, and along with Thomas Playford, could justifiably feel proud and confident for the future and in the achievements attained at Elizabeth. What had begun as a call to arms in response to Ben Chifley's populate or perish mandate of the 1940s was now being held around the country as an example in superior town and urban planning. The Elizabeth of 1955 had been an attempt to impose upon a rural landscape and the original home of the Kaurna people the physical and social coordinates of what by 1960 was being hailed as a city of tomorrow. Decent housing, new factories on serviced industrial sites, centrally located schools and neighbourhood shops, along with well thought out variants in rental housing, private homes, and a sprinkling of land left vacant for private home design to ensure a variety of social mix, was all an attempt to avoid the pitfalls of urban slums and social isolation more commonly found in the city, or developments that evolved more haphazardly as a result of circumstance or necessity. It was also the Trust's attempt to avoid mistakes they themselves had made at previous housing developments, such as those at Salisbury North. Up until 1960, Elizabeth had, more or less, developed at a pace anticipated in advance by the Trust and its chief architect, Henry Smith. So generally speaking, they were able to keep pace with population growth and the needs of the community in regards to shopping, education, and social activities. They were also able to construct the physical landscape of small factories, open parks, neighbourhood shops, schools, social balance in regards to housing and recreation facilities, with relative success and with no major obstacles from industrialists or the tenants that had come to populate the new town. In fact, by 1960, Elizabeth functioned as a more or less pleasant and cohesive community, populated by people grateful to have an opportunity to start again after the uncertainties and horrors of mid-20th century life, which had included not only the Great Depression, but also a world war. But what had not been anticipated in the original design was the arrival of an industrial power that would not only force the Trust and Playford to completely re-evaluate their original vision of Elizabeth, but also abandon the tight grip they had until now held over the town's development pace, as well as their well-thought-out ideas in regards to ideal social mix in relation to the ratio in construction of rental and privately owned housing. The arrival of General Motors Holden was hailed as a great coup for the Trust and for the future of Elizabeth, and set the new town on an entirely new trajectory, one that would contribute significantly to its eventual downfall.